You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 43, in which we dive into a once famous and now forgotten tale of murder and madness in Jim Crow, Mississippi in 1932. We are coming to you this week from the Mint Julep Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Piloting us through the past is our terrific executive producer, Lulu Spencer. We've got a lot going on here these days. Booking interviews with interesting guests, promoting the podcast to expand our listening community, and working on some fun stuff like In the Past Lane merchandise. You know, hats, t-shirts, coffee mugs, fridge magnets. I'll have more to say on that front soon. I'm also busy at my real job as a college professor. There are all the usual things like classes and grading papers. Plus, these next few weeks we have advising. That's when students stop by my office to talk about course selections for the next semester. And we usually end up talking about other things, like their plans to study abroad, or not, and what careers they're considering. And if they haven't yet chosen their major, I explain why history is a terrific major that will equip them to do just about anything once they head off into the so-called real world after graduation. Since the 2008 market crash, it's been increasingly difficult to make this case. Ever-growing numbers of students in the United States have become convinced that they need to major in something practical, like biology or engineering or economics, in order to secure a career after graduation. Or at least their anxious parents believe this to be true, and they put a lot of pressure on their kids to choose one of these majors, instead of something in the humanities like history or English or philosophy. And they do this even though all the available data shows that English, history, and philosophy majors do exceptionally well after graduation. Some go into teaching or law, but most head off to work in government, the nonprofit sector, and especially business. And beyond the data that shows this, recently there's been a spate of books and articles about business executives declaring how important humanities majors are to their companies. The best-known piece appeared in the Wall Street Journal in June of 2016, under the eye-catching title, Why I Was Wrong About Liberal Arts Majors. The article focused on a high-tech executive named David Kalt, founder of Reverb.com. He used to hire only engineers and computer science types. But over time, he changed his thinking. He said, looking back at the tech teams I've built at my companies, it's evident that individuals with liberal arts degrees are by far the sharpest, best-performing software developers and technology leaders. More recently, Scott Hartley published a book titled The Fuzzy and the Techie, Why the Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World. So my colleagues and I at the Holy Cross History Department have made it our mission to promote this message as a way to draw in more history majors. Last semester, for example, we held an evening session for history majors and people considering majoring in history. We brought back 4 recent graduates who had majored in history. One was an executive at Uber, another worked in commercial real estate, a third worked for a big educational publishing company, and another worked at a very successful internet retail startup. And they all said if they had it to do all over again, they would choose to major in history. Studying history, they said, expanded their knowledge of the world and made them more informed citizens, but it also gave them incredibly valuable skills in writing, public speaking, research, analysis, and project planning. So it's a struggle these days to convince people that history is still a great major, but we're committed to working hard to pull in as many history majors as possible. And lately our work is paying off. After seeing a pretty serious drop in history majors after 2008, a drop that occurred all across the country, my history department has seen in recent years an increase in the number of history majors. We now know that the good old days, when scores of students each year signed up to be history majors, are gone. These days, if we want history majors, we have to recruit them, by explaining to them and their anxious parents why history is a great major for the 21st century. All right, enough about the trials and tribulations of the liberal arts in 2017. What's up this week at In the Past Lane? Well, I'll speak with historian Karen Cox, author of a new book titled Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South. It tells the incredible story of a murder that took place in Mississippi in 1932. It's a captivating tale in its own right, but as you'll soon hear, the Goat Castle story reveals a great deal about the United States in the early years of the Great Depression. Everything from mass media and sensationalism to Jim Crow racism and popular nostalgia for the Old South. I'll be back with that conversation in just a minute. Okay, people, no need to pack a sweater. We're heading south to Mississippi. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
All right, Edward T. O'Donnell here at In the Past Lane. With me now is historian Karen Cox. Karen is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and she's the founding director of its graduate public history program. She is the author of many books on the history of the American South, including Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, as well as Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture. Karen also writes op-eds on history-related topics for publications like the New York Times and the Huffington Post. These include recent pieces addressing the controversy over Confederate monuments and the events in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're speaking with Karen today because she's just published a new book, Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South. Karen Cox, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
Great. Well, we're really interested to learn more about this new book of yours, Goat Castle, and to find out more about this remarkable tale, one that few people have heard of, but way back in the early 1930s seemed to be that everybody knew about it. So maybe you could start us off by providing our listeners with kind of a brief overview of the story itself, and then we can circle back and dive into the details of who these people were and how their lives collided in 1932, and then the kind of reaction that it produced.
Sure. This is a story set in the depths of the Depression in 1932, Natchez, Mississippi. And the basic outlines of the story is that a woman named Jenny Merrill was murdered in her home during a botched robbery. And within 2 days, the story made national headlines. The first national paper to pick up the story was the New York Times. And in the heading of that article, the headline was something about aristocratic recluses, murder, and goats. And so in that title, it almost indicated about where the media story was going to head when they began to discuss this case.
Right, really went straight to the sensation part of it. And it's understandable because it does have a lot of intrigue. It almost reads like a screenplay or a great novel that becomes a screenplay with a whodunit and all of that. So there are a number of important characters here. Why don't you start off by telling us more about who the two couples are that are at the center of the story and then how they get to that point in 1932?
Right. I actually see as three couples, none of whom are married to each other. So you have Jenny Merrill and her cousin, Duncan Minor, who are descendants of the planter aristocracy in Natchez. And they still have some of their money in 1932. Then there's Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery, who are Jenny Merrill's neighbors, who are also descended from the Southern planter class, except they have lost everything. They have no money. And Dana was the son of the Episcopal rector in Natchez, and Octavia Dockery was the daughter of a planter in Arkansas who went on to become a Confederate general. And she and Dick Dana lived together in a house known as Glenwood next door to Jenny Merrill. The third couple are two African Americans, One is known in the paper as George Pearls, who has arrived in Natchez in the summer of 1932 from Chicago, where he had migrated like so many African Americans had beginning in World War I. And he's back in town, and he's rented a room with a woman named Emily Burns, who was a domestic and was born in Natchez. And so these are the three couples. Well, at some point, all of their lives converge around this murder case. George Pearls has met Dana and Dockery and has figured out that Jenny Merrill has money, and so they make a plan to rob Jenny Merrill.
Now, is there a bit of a rivalry, or is there a backstory to, it's not only that Jenny Merrill has money and Dana and Dockery don't have money, but there's history there that's kind of fraught. Does that play into the plot in some way?
Yes, absolutely. Jenny Merrill and Octavia Dockery have lived unhappily as neighbors with one another for many years. And a lot of the anger between the women has to do with, I think a lot of it has to do with class, but the impetus for the disagreement between the two women is the trespassing of Octavia Dockery's livestock, whether it be hogs or goats, and then they go amble over next door and destroy property at Jenny Merrill's. And Merrill will take Octavia Dockery to court over that damage, and then Octavia Dockery would file her own lawsuits to try to get back her livestock from Jenny Merrill, who's holding them for ransom. And so there's this back and forth between these two women in the courts, even before the case of murder. And I think there's a resentment that Octavia Dockery definitely has, because she's living in poverty next door while this woman is taking her to court for what she considers a pittance. And so when Octavia Dockery meets and has a discussion with this man named George Pearls, who's known locally by probably his real name, Lawrence Williams, they make a plan. And Octavia Dockery knows the comings and goings of Jenny Merrill's cousin, Duncan Minor, who comes to stay with her every evening. I feel certain that she plotted this robbery, and they would do it at a time when it was after dark, but it was before Duncan Minor was to arrive. And so that's the basis of the plan to rob her. But what happens is that George Pearls is in agreement with this, but he's living with Emily Burns, and he asks her to go on a walk with him. And along the way, he explains what he's about to do, which is to rob Jenny Merrill. And so she's caught in a situation that she can't get out of, because he threatens to kill her if she says anything.
Right.
And they meet up with Dana and Dockery, and the four of them, and there's possibly a fifth person, go to Jenny Merrill's house, wait to when things get quiet enough, and then George Pearls enters the home to rob Jenny Merrill. And Jenny Merrill was a feisty little lady. She only stood about 5 feet tall and weighed, 90 pounds soaking wet. But she was feisty and she had guns, and it's very likely that she put up a fight. And in doing so, she was shot and killed in her home, after which they took the body outside to dispense with it. And Dana and Dockery, George Pearls, and perhaps a friend of his named Edgar Allan Poe Newell, which you can't make up.
Exactly.
Entered the house. And so they tossed furniture around, pulled drawers out, etc., leaving their fingerprints everywhere, while Emily Burns stood outside as a watch. And so that was like kind of the night of the murder. And then they all disperse, and Duncan Minor arrives, and he's informed by a couple of men who work for Jenny Merrill on her estate that something has happened. They heard screaming and shots. And then he goes to the house and discovers blood in the house, but he doesn't discover Jenny Merrill. So in that moment, all of those couples' lives become intertwined.
And so at that point, they discover that Jenny Merrill has been murdered. And the question is, who done it? And does suspicion immediately go to the rival family, the rival couple, I should say, Dana and Dockery? And how does the initial hunch or the initial search for the killer resolved?
Right. Well, the sheriff's department and the sheriff, Clarence Roberts, is known as Book Roberts. Book Roberts has a suspicion that the neighbors are involved, because Jenny Merrill and Octavia Dockery had feuded year in and year out, and the sheriff's office had been called in and year out to go see what the latest beef was. And apparently then that week, leading up to Jenny Merrill's murder, the two women had gotten into a particularly vicious argument with one another over these trespassing issues. So it was the sheriff's inclination to go interview them. By this time, it's 11 near midnight, and he goes with a deputy sheriff over to Glenwood to interview Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery, and he calls out for Dick Dana, and no one's answering. He calls again, and no one's answering, and he sees a bloody shirt that has been washed out laying around, which he finds suspicious because Dick Dana is notoriously known for not bathing or washing any of his clothes.
Right, they're really living in sort of filth and poverty.
They're living in absolute filth. If you can imagine, this is the Grey Gardens of the South in 1932. It's overrun with animals, particularly their goats actually live in a pen inside of the house. Cats and chickens and geese, and it's just covered with the filth of animals and their waste. So the sheriff calls out, and finally Dick Dana emerges, and he comes down the stairs, and before the sheriff has even had a chance to say the first word to him, he blurts out, "I know nothing of the murder."
Well, not exactly a good strategy.
Well, now he's immediately arrested, and Octavia Dockery, we don't know what she said, but whatever she said was suspicious enough that she was arrested as well. So they are the first two to go in. And it's important to understand here that Dick Dana, while he's descended from this important family, the Danas of New England, he's related to ministers. He has a relation to Charles Dana Gibson, who drew the Gibson Girls. He's related to Charles Dana, another Charles Dana of the New York Sun. So he has this interesting lineage. But in 1932, and even, before then, he had been declared non compos mentis. So he would have been in an asylum in the state had it not been for Octavia Dockery, right, who became his legal guardian. So she was concerned that he might say something, and indeed he did.
Right. So the suspicion falls on them. And then how does George Pearls come back into the story? And this is where, as you note, this seemingly eccentric murder mystery and all of its sensation that we can talk about in a little bit, but all of that obscures the fact that at the heart of this is a story of racial injustice in Jim Crow America. So what's next in the next chapter of this, or the next stage in this story that involves George Pearls?
Well, as it would happen in the Jim Crow South, the investigation turns toward the Black community. They do initially round up people who live on the Jenny Merrill's estate or in the neighborhood around Glenwood to question them. And then someone in the Black community hints at the fact that there was a man in town who was not particularly known to people, but he was from Natchez, which is George Pearls, and that he had been in town. And this lined up with what Duncan Miner said, which that there had been what he called a strange Negro in the community who had come to ask for work or for money from him and Jenny Merrill. And so the attention immediately went to try to find out who that strange Negro was. And so they went out into the community, and someone tipped them off that a man had been staying with Emily Burns and had left his trunk of belongings behind. But the way they connected is kind of interesting, because after the murder, George Pearls, or Lawrence Williams, leaves town swiftly, and he's making his way back to Chicago when he's, as happens to Black men in the Jim Crow South, is just picked up randomly. And a police deputy asks to speak with him, and that deputy suggests that Pearls had resisted arrest. And so the deputy shot him 6 times, killing him on the streets of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Because the news had gotten out, the police deputy calls the sheriff in Adams County, says, "We think we've got your man." He had, information on him identifying him as George Pearls. The sheriff in Adams County didn't recognize that name. He wasn't looking for George Pearls. But when the sheriff is tipped off to go look in the home of Emily Burns, that this man had been staying there, they pick up the trunk, and what they find in the trunk are insurance papers made out to a man named George Pearls. So they put it all together that Lawrence Williams and George Pearls are the same man. And so at this point, he's dead. So they take Emily Burns and her mother into the jail. and they begin questioning them.
Right. So it's not enough that the man who's emerging as the chief suspect is killed. There's still a hunger to find other culprits, and in this case, other African-American culprits.
Exactly, because it would have not have been satisfying to the community to know that this woman who's descended from planter aristocracy in a town that valued that no one went to jail for it. No one went to prison or was hung for it. It was not satisfying that he was the primary suspect and he would ultimately be convicted posthumously as that person who killed Jenny Merrill. They had to have someone else. And in this case, it was really an innocent woman in my mind, Emily Burns, who was caught up in an unfortunate situation in which she had no way to turn. If she left that evening, George Pearl's or Lawrence Williams threatened to kill her. And now that it had all happened, she was living in fear that she was going to be arrested. And indeed she was. And then she pays the ultimate price. Well, not the ultimate price she could have paid with her life, but she pays the price for Jenny Merrill's murder. Right.
So she goes off to prison eventually. And by now, this has become literally a national story fueled by the media. And do you have any sense of why this, it's got all the makings of a really bizarre story that is engaging and people, it almost feels like it's a made up story. But to what extent is this a product of the time? It's the Great Depression, so people are looking for distraction. It's also a time of national media really coming into its own with syndications of, news wire services and then also radio. Does this play into the sensation?
Oh, yes, absolutely. If you were to pick up a paper in 1932, month after month, week after week, you would see stories of true crime. And that it became almost a form of entertainment, whether it was, gangsters.
Yeah, Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, any of the gangsters, or if it was wealthy people who had gotten caught up in, some sort of crime where they killed someone. Those things kept newspapers going and they could tell the story almost as a serial. And so keep people buying newspapers or they want to know, how is this case unfolding? And indeed, the story, however, became less about the murder, but more about Dick, Dana, and Octavia Dockery and the conditions in which they lived next door. And so immediately the story becomes about them and their home. And Dana is nicknamed the Wild Man, and Dockery becomes the Goat Woman, and they nickname the house Goat Castle.
So people all across the United States see Goat Castle and they know what it is because it refers to this incredible story. What about one thing that occurred to me, and particularly given your work on Southern history, Southern memory, and Southern image in popular culture, is that one thing that seems to me that probably drives some of this sensation is just the hunger in particularly among Northern and Western American audiences for things to do with the Lost Cause and the Old South. There's a lot of nostalgia, a lot of ideas in people's minds about, really attractiveness of those stories. And this is, of course, pre-Gone with the Wind, but that's why Gone with the Wind a few years later is such a smash because it taps right into that. Do you see the Lost Cause and nostalgia for the long-lost South as part of the story?
I think there is this nostalgia for the Old South. Natchez is basically serving up nostalgia in this time. A few months before the murder, they began their annual pilgrimage of homes. And these were really magnificent antebellum mansions. And people had already been coming into Natchez and trespassing on the grounds of these estates to see these houses. In some ways, Natchez was the embodiment of the Old South and that romance. And yet Goat Castle represented this completely different image of the South that we were more likely to associate with the Southern Gothic. Initially, the analogies were made with Edgar Allan Poe and the fall of the House of Usher. But not long after, there would be discussions of how Goat Castle was a story that could have come from the pen of William Faulkner. So there are these two images of the South. You have the romantic Old South that Natchez represents, but then this fallen, crumbling Southern civilization as represented by Goat Castle and the people who live there.
Yeah. fascinating on so many different levels. Well, why don't we return to the rest of the story? Emily Burns goes off to prison. She eventually is released, but spends a fair amount of time in prison. Dana and Dockery, what happens to them? They were prime suspects at one point. What's their legal fate? And then what happens to them moving forward?
Well, essentially, they capitalize on their notoriety. They do two things. One is that they recognize that there's a fascination with their lives and their estate. Even as they're sitting in prison, hundreds of people are trespassing onto the grounds of Glenwood/Goat Castle to get a peep at the house, some of which go into the house and actually take things from their home. And then when they finally get out of prison, they have a group of people who are advising them, and they decide to open the house for tours. They clean it up enough so that Dick Dana can perform piano concerts. He did have a career early in his life as a pianist, and he apparently could sing. And so he would offer concerts in the house on the weekends twice a day, and Octavia Dockery would tell tales of the Old South. And essentially, they capitalized on their notoriety, but also played off of the pilgrimage in Natchez, which was about touring homes. So they charged 25 cents just to see the grounds, and then another 25 cents to get inside the house. So they began making money on this. And then the other thing that they did, and this was while they were still charged with murder, they themselves went on tour as a stage act in which they were introduced as the wild man and goat woman of Goat Castle. And Dana would appear on stage in the coveralls he was arrested in, because there was a picture of the two of them, that photograph taken in the jail that circulated nationwide. So people not only read the story, but they saw the goat woman and the wild man in these photographs.
Right.
So they made money off of it. They toured primarily throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. So what ends up happening is when the November grand jury meets, the sheriff offers up all of his evidence, and he says, I believe I have enough for several indictments. And he meant, they would, have George Pearls would be included, Emily Burns would be there, but he also had in mind, without saying so, that Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery would be there. And what's interesting about all of this is that the only person really who is indicted is Emily Burns. And she basically acted as a lookout, and all the fingerprint evidence, which included Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery's from inside the house, was completely disregarded. So they basically got to go home on their own recognizance, were never indicted for murder, even though they were charged with it. They never were indicted by the grand jury. And then Emily Burns is the only one to be convicted, and then she's sent to the state penitentiary. But Octavia Dockery is just this cunning woman, and she decides to sue the sheriff the next year for her false imprisonment and humiliating her and Dick Dana. And she files this big lawsuit, and then the sheriff's just had enough, and he brings them back up on charges of murder again. And in this case that really is declared a mistrial, we learn that the grand jury from the year before did vote to indict the two of them for murder, but the district attorney decided not to go forward with that case. And the sheriff kind of went along with it. And I'm not sure the legalities of that, but even though their fingerprints were found inside the house, they never went to court and were tried for the murder. So they continued until their dying days to live at Goat Castle, to collect receipts from tourists to their estate until they died. And he died in October of 48, and 4 months later, she died. And what's interesting is, even though Glenwood had been Dick Dana's inheritance, he was born on the estate and had grown up in Glenwood by the time they came to live there as adults in 1916, and until their deaths in the late 40s, they didn't own the place. They were essentially squatters, and attempts to evict them were futile. And so until she was literally on her deathbed, ready to sue someone else to keep Goat Castle.
There's so many ways to look at this, but it's such a vivid example of, in a society and in that setting, what the privileges are of having white skin and also some sort of heritage that protects you from the law.
Yes.
And the opposite being the case for George Pearls and Emily Burns. Well, this is a fascinating story, and really your book is terrific in conveying all of these things. But one thing I always ask my historian interviewees is, apart from the fact that it is a fascinating tale, is there something in this book or in this story that's important for people to know in 2017? Is there any kind of takeaway about a story like this?
I think what's interesting to me, and first of all, it was one of the most rewarding books I've ever written. I got to meet the family members, extended family members of Emily Burns, and I attended her church. That's the only way I learned her story, really, was having gone to visit her church and learned that she didn't go by Emily, she went by sister. But I think the takeaway is that we are still today dealing with living in a society in which justice is meted out through the double standard, depending on your race. And the incarceration of Emily Burns could almost have been written in 2017. And because women of color were overwhelmingly those who went to prison, as well as Black men. But what makes it different today is it's not the Jim Crow South. It's all of the United States.
Right. And the same could be said of the George Pearls killing.
Exactly.
He's stopped for looking suspicious by an Arkansas policeman, and with no witnesses is shot 6 times and killed. So there's some eerie parallels or connections to the present and the things that we're debating in our contemporary society.
Yeah. When I was reading, I actually had written a little op-ed about that after the shooting in Baton Rouge of a man. I think he was shot several times, and the police were, obviously were not charged. But this language that's used around African-American men, for example, that they're suspicious, that they would have referred in the Jim Crow period, they would have called a man like George Pearls a brute.
Yep.
Whereas, today the word is thug. And so it's a language that criminalizes Black men like George Pearls, as well as those who are being incarcerated today.
It's a fascinating story in its own right, but also one that, as you note, does speak to some of the issues today. Well, Karen Cox, thank you so much for speaking to us in the Past Lane.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to do it.
Karen Cox is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and the author of the book Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South, just published by the University of North Carolina Press. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. That really helps to bring in new listeners. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. I also want to hear from you, so please send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, Instagram, and our Facebook page. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, I sense you have a question. Shoot.
How exactly did you get this gig?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.